10. Is it 10?
It is.
Now what? Oh. All right. Good morning. Being 10 o'clock, we'll call the Finance Committee meeting to order for a hearing on Senate Bill 406 FNA. And I'll call the only person I have a pink sheet from is Donovan Fenton.
That's me.
Good
I'm
morning.
a little nervous. I only have one pink sheet, though. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, I am Senator Donovan Fenton. I represent District 10, and I'm here to introduce Senate Bill 406, making an appropriation to the Department of Health and Human Services to increase rates for shelter programs. We have a homeless issue here in New Hampshire. People experiencing homelessness in New Hampshire is up more than 50% in the last year. There are many factors leading to this issue, ranging from housing shortages, lack of programs, and income levels. This bill appropriates $2.5 million to the Department of Health and Human Services to increase rates paid to shelter programs. This bill requires programs receiving funds to prioritize veterans and the distribution of services to the greatest extent practicable. This bill was amended by the Senate Finance Committee to have the Department of Health and Human Services require that recipients of this funding submit financial projections covering the term of contract as well as ongoing financial statements demonstrating the financial sustainability. Our shelters need this bill to continue providing life-saving services to New Hampshire citizens experiencing homelessness. There's been a lot of bipartisan work done on this in the Senate, and I hope the committee will support this important bill. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from committee members? Representative Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not a question as much as it is a notice. Division 3 has a work session on this bill at 2:30, and I expect that we're going to go into depth about this bill and what we're looking for. As a heads up, I would appreciate at 2:30 to have sort of a lay down or a perspective on where we think the money's going to go geographically within the state. I know we have big needs in Manchester. I know we have needs around the state and other shelters. I just would like to see where those are.
Representative, thank you for that, and I will get that to you this afternoon. If you don't have it before
Thank
that.
you, Senator.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Representative Popovici Mueller for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator, for presenting the bill. I had two very quick questions, and if you don't have the answers right now, if maybe they
I
could
hope
be
I
made
have them.
available, First, the 2.5 million that we appropriate, how much of a percentage increase is that to the current amounts that we are paying for shelter services?
Absolutely. So I'm assuming you all have the handout.
Yep.
Yeah, so at the bottom of it, you can see that this will raise the rates from $20 per bed to $27 per bed. But in reality, true costs for shelter beds are $45 to $75 per bed. So we're barely even scratching the surface with this money.
Thank you. And the last paragraph that you were mentioning in your presentation, that the recipients of this funding will have to have projections and so on. Is that addressing an existing problem where, the state is giving funds to shelters and shelters get shut down and keep the funding? What was the impetus for that? I mean, I understand it as a general precaution, but I was curious whether there were specific incidents or cases that made the, Senate feel that was necessary. Because it seems to create a burden on the shelters, and obviously you can justify that, but
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I don't think we want to create a burden any more so on shelters, but we do want to see how the money is being utilized and how it's tracking and how we're helping these shelters. I think, good governance, we see what we're getting on return on our investment.
thank you.
Representative Murray for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on that, I was asking about the projections for the expectations for the facilities. Is there a sense of that around sustainability, or are you looking to see what growth or diminishment of people who are using these services? I guess just a little bit more information about what you would see in that request.
Thank you for the question. You're not going to see any growth because this money does not create new beds. We have an issue where we had a lot of federal money for these shelter programs, and that money is gone now. And these shelters have been running at that capacity, and they're all full. I don't think there's a single open bed right now. And all the shelters are full, and they've been running with all that money that we've had from the federal government, but that's gone now. And we need to keep them sustained. This is a Band-Aid for a bullet wound. This is not a long-term fix by any means. And the original bill was much more comprehensive, but after working, with my Senate colleagues in a bipartisan manner, we kind of boiled it down to this. And the plan is, we're going to come back to the table next year with a much more comprehensive bill, but this is a plug in this leaky ship, and they desperately need this money.
Follow up?
Thank you. Oh, and nice to see you here. I was also asking, will there be a growth in the population?
A growth in the population of the homeless.
The people who will be needing these services?
I think we are experiencing growth in homelessness across the state, no matter if this money comes or if it doesn't. We need to address the homeless issue we're having in New Hampshire. This bill doesn't necessarily do that. This bill helps the existing shelters that we already have. And most of these shelter beds, like I said, are completely full, or, they might have one bed open. But the shelters desperately need this money.
And members, I now have 8 more cards. We'll hear from more people. Representative Stringham for a question.
So extra $7 a day, that's just running the math, that's roughly 1,000 beds. Is that the state capacity right now? And the follow-up question to that would be, is your concern if we don't do this that the number of beds we'd have available might go down? Because you've already expressed that this is not going to increase the number of beds, and all the money that we're appropriating is for existing capacity to help shore that up. Thank you.
I can't give you the state capacity. I think someone behind me most certainly can, but I will say, no, this money's not creating beds. I want to be very clear with that. But if we don't give this money, you may see shelters dial back their services, which will lose beds. These shelters are desperate for funds, and the last thing we want to do is lose a bed because we're at such capacity.
Further questions? Representative Cambrils.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking the question. It says here in the bill that you shall not knowingly provide services to any person not legally present in the United States. So what proactive measures are taken in order to determine if a person is legal or not?
I would thank you for the question. I would certainly ask the shelters that question. What I understand is, and I've actually volunteered in shelters before. I've done a 7 p.m. shift to a 7 a.m. shift. These are people in your community. These are, local members that you see often every day. And homelessness can really affect anyone. It's economics, down on their luck people. So when it comes to, legal residents, the shelters have a process in place to verify who's coming into their shelter. And I would certainly follow up with anyone behind me as well on that.
Any further questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, folks. And I'm going to zip to my committee hearing, so I apologize for not sticking around, but I'll get you that information, Rep. Edwards.
We'll next call on Susan Ford from Farmington, New Hampshire. Good morning.
Sorry, I'm new to this. My name is Susan Ford. I'm the executive director of my friend's place in Dover, New Hampshire. I'm here as a representative of myself from the town of Farmington, as well as the shelter. My shelter is a $500,000 shelter right now, and we get $200,000 from the state. So that means we have to fundraise $300,000 to service the population that we serve. We offer extensive case management services, enrichment classes, sobriety classes, mental health classes, and we can't do that with the funding that we're getting right now. I am literally bare bones. I have one person on duty from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 7 o'clock the next morning, and we're serving people with severe mental health injuries, illnesses, people with criminal record backgrounds that are present on our door, and we're mandated by state contract to serve them until they do something at the shelter. I had the police at my shelter this weekend because somebody at the shelter threatened to spray them with pepper spray, and they had pepper spray on them. we don't have the staff to search people and their baggage. We don't have the staff or the capabilities to make sure that everybody passes the background check. To answer your question about IDs, we do take copies of any IDs that they have on intake, and that is our first and foremost job if they don't have identification, is to help them get identification. Our services are around self-sufficiency. So our case manager works diligently on a case plan to get them identification, to rule out barriers to employment, to offer substance abuse services if necessary. We refer out to other agencies for those types of services that they might need to get them job ready for long-lasting self-sufficiency.
Any questions from committee members? Excuse me. Representative Telersky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. While the bill is pretty bare bones in terms of it's just an additional 2.5 million, and you would not be able to determine how much your organization would be able to benefit from increased funding. Let's just say, what would be your priority if you were to receive an additional $25,000 or whatever the amount? What would be your top priority?
Increasing staff wages. Like I said, I'm literally competing with $17 to $20 an hour from Burger King and McDonald's, and Dunkin' Donuts are all paying 17 to start in my area.
Follow up quickly.
Follow up.
And what do you pay now?
17 if they're not alone, and 20 if they are.
Thank you.
Representative Hull for a question.
Thank you. How many beds?
I have 28 beds.
Thank you.
Further questions from committee members? Representative Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your experience, I think the Housing First federal policy has been in place something like 20 years. And from my understanding, viewing it through the Liberty House spectrum, the Housing First policy creates a tremendous challenge for our homeless shelters because we can't eliminate the bad apples that continue to abuse substances, and therefore we continually repollute the population that's in the homeless shelters, exacerbating and continuing the problem. Is that your experience? Could you speak to the Housing First policy and whether, so that we know that as a state, whether we want to petition our federal delegation to change that policy?
I'm going to be really politically incorrect here. I'm very
Good.
sorry.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. I understand that Housing First, in theory, works. I've heard it work in other states. Great. I personally don't see how it's working. I'm working with landlords that do credit checks. I have a family right now that makes $80,000 a year and can't find an apartment because his credit isn't well enough, because he's never had a loan. So we have him in our transitional housing, not taking beds and shelters, but this is a family of 4. She's on Social Security. He works as a cook at the Orr House and makes somewhere between $70,000 to $90,000 a year, and cannot find an apartment because he has a 600 credit score. How does Housing First work when you're working with landlords that are not interested in Housing First? They've been burned so many times that they're not interested in taking a chance on a client. Landlords won't even talk to us and take us as a referral. He's paid his rent on time. He's paid his savings. He pays $1,554 in rent, $750 a month in savings every month for 9 months, and I still can't get him an apartment. How is Housing First working? I want money to build an SRO, so I can put my singles, that I'm serving more singles now than families, so that I can put them in there into transitional housing and work long-term with those individuals, so they're not taking up shelter beds. They're sober for about 3 to 6 months and really working on case management, proving that they want to really maintain sobriety, and put them in an apartment where they can police themselves and we can have case management. But I can't do that right now because there's no money available.
Representative Cambrils for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do. Question, would you happen to know what percentage of the people that you have now there might be veterans?
I have 2 veterans right now.
Any further questions from committee? Seeing none? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
We'll next call on Will Arvello from Crossroads House. Good morning.
There, is that on?
Crossroads.
Okay. Again, my name is Will Arvell. I'm the Executive Director of Crossroads House. I am here to support this bill for the reasons that have already been stated. Just to preface, we are the second largest homeless shelter in the state. We're a low barrier shelter. We serve Rockingham, Stratford County. We also have the only warming shelter for winter warming shelter that serves all of Rockingham County. Last year, we served 461 individuals. So we serve men, women, and families. We can house up to 12 families. And the average stay for us is about 62 days. We are very intensive on case management, and we're very successful because of that. I mean, you talk about housing first, and I would say that one of the things that makes us successful in terms of working with landlords is that we provide that case management. Landlords are very difficult to work with if we don't provide the assurance that we will work with them if any issues come up over time. So, we're very appreciative of the fact that the state increased funding for us to $20 per bed from $8 per bed last year. This increase to $27 is not going to solve the problem, as Senator Fenton said, but it will help us through this period of growth. So we are projecting that we will be over 500 individuals this year and continue to grow. And the reason for that is because we are seeing more homeless. And the homeless population is so diverse now. It's not what we all have thought about in the past. The biggest growth in homelessness, as some of you may be aware, is in the elderly population, people who are on fixed incomes and can no longer afford to stay in their places, as well as families and women. So, for example, when we built our facility back in 2008, 2009, we built it because we had more men at the time, so we can house double the number of men than we do women. It has turned out that today, we have many more women that are becoming homeless, and therefore this is an inequity that we have to address in our facility. But that's one of the issues that we have to address. So we're seeing more women, more families, and more elderly. The elderly, of course, come with underlying health issues which shelters are not prepared to deal with. So we have to work very closely with our local hospitals to address those issues. But so we would, if we get this money, we would use this money to support our staff. I mean, our staff, we start them at $17.50. Case managers are $20 plus. But that's, again, we're competing with the marketplace. And in order for us to attract and retain qualified individuals to do this very stressful work, we have to be able to pay more. And we're really not there yet. So I will stop there and take any questions.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Wow, thank you.
We'll next call on Stephen Tower from New Hampshire Legal Assistance.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Steve Tower from New Hampshire Legal Assistance. I am the managing attorney at our office in Manchester. I'm also the director of our local welfare project, which deals with legal issues involving the local welfare statute, which, as you know, is a program where municipalities provide basic minimal support to people who are poor and unable to support themselves. And a lot of that involves referrals to shelters for people who are homeless. I've been doing local welfare work for NHLA for almost 10 years now, and the demands that towns are facing and the demands that shelters are facing have substantially increased. Like, very noticeably have increased over that time. So I recognize that this bill is a Band-Aid to prevent our shelter system from getting worse, but I would urge the committee to pass this bill and to, in the future, consider more steps to try to address the homelessness crisis, which is the other half of the general housing crisis that we're seeing in the state. Not to take up too much more of your time, but I did want to mention one fact that even as a homeless advocate, I recently learned and was shocking to me. I was talking to a welfare director from one of the larger municipalities who mentioned that in addition to the difficulties of finding shelter beds available, in the past, there had been the availability of referring single individuals to, what are they called? I'm drawing a blank on the name. It's a facility that's a rooming house, and that in the past, rooming houses were seen as fairly undesirable and sort of a housing opportunity of last resort for people who couldn't get into a more traditional apartment. But this local welfare director has told me that in conversations with people who run rooming houses, they have been told that the folks who are now applying for that single room in a rooming house are people who are making $3,000 a month, sometimes $5,000 a month, and that is the housing that they are able to find. And I'm sure they don't want to be there, but that's sort of the housing of last resort. And I hear that, and I look at my clients who are homeless, and they're living on $800 or $900 a month of Social Security, and I just don't know what to do with them. The housing options are not out there. The shelter options are not out there. It's scary, and I just think it's going to continue to get worse in the near future. So thank you for considering this bill, and I hope that going forward, you can continue to address this issue.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? Representative Edwards.
So we've heard, thank you for taking my question. And I'm looking for your local leadership perspective on the answer to this. And that is, you've said that we've got a Band-Aid situation. This isn't going to solve the problem. You've cited some specific issues where people with resources are still struggling to find housing. Where do you think a permanent, good, sustainable position is going to come from? What might that look like? Throwing money at an ongoing problem without addressing the underlying problem is probably not good policy. Do you have a vision for us to consider?
It's not exactly my wheelhouse of low income legal issues, but as somebody who deals with the issue, I think we just need to build a lot more housing, like 10 to 20 times more than what we're currently building, which is more than what we've been building in the past. We need to build housing at all affordability levels. We need low income housing. We need, any kind of housing you can build. In Manchester, I would like to see 10 to 15 story apartment buildings going up everywhere. I think that's really the only way we're going to fix this. And that's, I'm sure, maybe not an encouraging thought, but it's just the change that I have seen in the demands of the homeless population and the size of the homeless population since, say, 2016, 2017 to now is very substantial. And it is a lot of people who are not your sort of stereotypical people who can't hold a job, people who have drug issues. I have a lot of seniors who can't afford the apartment that they've been living in for the last 18 years. Or families who, often, again, seniors who maybe their 50-year-old daughter or son moved in with them and caused problems for them, and they faced an eviction, and now they can't find an apartment because the housing market is so tight that if you have an eviction on your record, no landlord is going to take you because they don't have to. They can be very selective in this market right now. If you have bad credit, you have credit less than 650 or 700, a landlord doesn't have to accept you because they've got a stack of 50 other applicants for that same apartment the first week they list it. we just need more housing.
Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, call on Kara Ann, I think it's Rodenheiser, Home for All Home for All Coalition. Did I say your name right?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Cara Ann Rodenheiser. I'm the director of the Home for All Coalition and here on behalf of Housing Action New Hampshire. I am here today in support of Senate Bill 406. I would like to start by recognizing that this is an off-budget year in the legislature and thank this committee for considering the emergency funding that, as we've heard, is so desperately needed. I'd also like to thank the committee for your role in moving a great deal of pandemic relief funding towards housing stabilization. At Housing Action New Hampshire, we recognize the tremendous work that entailed by legislators and practitioners. We did come out of the pandemic, unfortunately, with an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. However, without the work you all put into this, we would be in a much worse position. The last budget passed by the legislature included a $10 million increase to shelter contracts. But as we've heard earlier from Senator Fenton, the per night cost of a shelter bed is about $47 in the state. Prior to this budget, the state was reimbursing at about $8 of that cost. Last year's budget brought that number up to 20, but as you can see, there is still a significant gap, and we've heard that from a few folks this morning. Unfortunately, this increase in the reimbursement also came at a time where we're seeing an increase in need, a steep demand for services, and some of our most critical shelters that will serve so many people are at risk of closing if we don't grant this special appropriation. I serve as the director of Home for All Coalition and on the governing council of Housing Action New Hampshire. And in my role with Home for All, working with many shelter providers, I've observed for quite some time that the demand for shelter is far greater than what shelters are able to provide. On the Seacoast, the shelters are routinely at or over capacity, which has continued to prevail so long as the housing prices stay where they are and any units that are available are so far out of reach for some of our most vulnerable residents in New Hampshire. When there's not adequate shelter beds available, folks are living in unsafe, substandard housing situations. They might be couch surfing, putting other households at risk of losing their housing. And we see a continued increase in calls for shelter. And in a previous role, I was on the other end of the phone taking many of those calls for shelter. And this was pre-pandemic, but there is no worse feeling than taking a call from somebody in the middle of the night who had their one window of opportunity to flee abuse with their children and have to tell them, I'm really sorry, the best thing we can do right now is safety plan and sleep in the parking lot of a hospital because there are no shelter beds available for you or your children. And that's something that I think we're going to continue to see, and I cannot imagine what those calls sound like if we're losing shelter beds. And I also want to just mention that shelters are often the first line of defense for picking up where many other systems have failed, whether it is affordable housing, healthcare, criminal justice, or more. They really play an important role in our communities, and I continuously hear that there is a need for better access to services, particularly to prevent homelessness, but also for those exiting a period of homelessness. I've seen in my current role firsthand how transformational shelter can be. It's so much more than just providing a bed. We've seen that with those supportive services and the right staffing in those case management roles, somebody can really succeed and become thriving members of our community and thus prevent returns to homelessness. But without that support, it can very easily become a revolving door for those who are lucky to get the opportunity to get a bed, which there certainly is not enough. We saw the substantial investments made as part of a pandemic that did help our communities and keep families from experiencing homelessness, but also provided really critical resources for those that unfortunately were unhoused at the time. And in the midst of this housing crisis, our shelter systems are extremely overwhelmed, and without increased support of any kind, our providers can't handle the demand. I also lastly would like to close off that we recognize that the Department of Health and Human Services did ask for $24 million for shelter contracts for the 24-25 fiscal year, and they received 10 million. So again, we truly appreciate your consideration for adding another 2.5 to help sustain services until the next budget cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from committee members? Who did you see?
Me.
Oh. Representative Edwards for a question. You were pointing to somebody else.
Yeah, no, that was me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're using some numbers that I don't think we've heard here yet this morning, where you said we were at $8 a day. Now we're at $20 a day. I was talking to the mayor of Manchester last night, and he thinks that if this bill passes, it'll be $24 a day, or in that neighborhood. Assuming that's a correct number, and your costs are $47 a day, and this will still only be $24 a day, are we still on the brink of failure of our homeless shelter systems? And what would that, are you able to survive on $24 a day is part one of the question. And two, what does failure of the shelter system look like?
Sure. So I am not a shelter provider, so I'm not sure that I can speak to that entirely, but I can say without that support, they're not going to have the staffing, or they're going to be able to provide minimal support, meaning they're only able to triage what's right in front of them, which is the people in their shelter. It's not addressing their ability to help them with the skills that they need to not return.
So that's great. I'll wait in case there's somebody who may be able to answer the question more completely than you're in a position to do. But thank you.
Further questions from committee? Representative Atkins-Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for taking my question. I'm just wondering, could you speak to a little bit more about your population, how many people you're serving?
The Home for All Coalition is not a shelter provider, but we work with shelter providers throughout the Seacoast. So many of the folks here that are in this room, we've worked with in some capacity. Our coalition has seen amongst our shelter providers, but also not your typical service providers. So we hear from our food pantries that while their job is to provide food to those who are food insecure, they're also faced with helping those that come into their pantries the ability to find housing. And so we're seeing it across multiple providers that there is an increase. I can't speak to those numbers per se. Our coalition did work with many of these providers in 2020 to pilot a program called the Affordable Housing Incentive Program. And I know since 2020, we've been able to move just on the Seacoast over 200 individuals from shelters, from unsafe housing situations into permanent housing with about a 92% success rate. And that success is directly a result of the shelter providers we worked with, who had the staff and capacity to continue to follow these individuals after they were in shelter into permanent housing so that they could be successful.
Representative
you.
Murray for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. This is a little maybe to the side, but for my benefit and maybe for a few others, can you provide some historical perspective in terms of where we are now? Because it seems to me in my memory, churches used to help out with shelter, churches used to help out with, well, they still do with food pantries, but they used to be a resource. And somehow that doesn't seem to be that they're a resource anymore. Do you have any, can you speak to that transition to where we lost that help? And I'm in no way suggesting we should go back to that. I'm just curious to understand the progression a little bit.
Sure. I think churches are helping in the ways that they're able to now. I don't know that all churches are well positioned to provide shelter. Those that are able to, I imagine, still are doing so. But we also are seeing churches step up in a way that they haven't before in giving their land to the community to steward for affordable housing to play their role in addressing the housing crisis. But churches by themselves won't be able to solve this problem.
Any further questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. We'll next call on Ben Bradley from the New Hampshire Hospital Association.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name's Ben Bradley. I'm the Vice President of State Government Relations for the New Hampshire Hospital Association. We represent all 26 of New Hampshire's acute care hospitals and all specialty hospitals. We strongly support SB 406 and the $2.5 million appropriation this provides to shelter programs. You've heard from folks in the shelter community about their concerns. I want to provide a little different perspective on why we support this bill as well. Beyond the direct benefit to the homeless, SB 406 would help support our efforts to reduce barriers to hospital discharge. Across New Hampshire, patients who no longer need care in a hospital are stuck in hospital beds awaiting safe discharge for various reasons. One of the barriers identified in a recent March 2024 Foundation for Healthy Communities summary report is homelessness and housing insecurity. In order to move a patient out of the hospital setting, our members are required to ensure the patient is leaving for a safe environment. This bill would help support the access to shelters where patients could be safely discharged if they're homeless. I understand it doesn't increase the beds, but it would be deeply concerning given the existing scenario we face if they were reduced in any capacity. Discharge delays impact not only patients awaiting that discharge, but also those needing inpatient beds waiting in emergency departments. On any given day, dozens of patients in New Hampshire are waiting in an emergency department to be admitted for hospital care, but cannot be admitted because an inpatient bed is not available. Getting homeless patients out of the hospital and into an appropriate setting frees up additional capacity for patients truly in need of hospital care. SB 406 would greatly benefit Granite Staters in multiple ways, and I urge the committee to support the bill. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? Representative Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for taking the question. I want to understand the underlying logic behind the statement that 406 will make a difference in the discharge rates from hospitals. It's my understanding we're going to move from $20 a day to $24 a day, that we're already at max capacity in all of our shelters. So I don't see this 406 moving the needle very much, if at all, really, other than to keep some of these shelters from going out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it you see, from the Hospital Association perspective, that this bill will actually help your discharge issue?
Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is the latter point of your statement, which is sustaining shelter programs, sustaining shelter beds.
Further questions from committee members? Representative Popovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know whether this is something we want to get into in detail in a hearing, but I'm not sure where obviously the obligation to only discharge patients if they have a safe environment, it seems to basically force hospitals to retain patients that no longer have a medical need to be in the hospital, but you're unable to discharge them. What is who created that obligation? And again, let's keep it short because
Sure. I'm happy to follow up with you, but I'll stick to existing statute that puts an obligation on the hospitals to serve the community and ensure that when they are discharged, it's in a safe environment.
Federal or state statutes?
I would say both.
Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Stringham for a question.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question and thanks for your testimony. The legislature made quite an investment in increasing certain Medicaid rates, particularly nursing homes and at-home systems, to provide hopefully more access for people who are ready for discharge from hospitals but have nowhere to go. I realize it's early in this biennium, but have you seen any movement at all in increased access for people who were stuck at the hospital? Or are we about the same place we were, say, a year ago?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Representative. Like you said, I think it's early. That was the intent of our hope, that those increased rates would help support those facilities that we could appropriately discharge to. I'm not prepared to speak to how effective that has been at this point.
Representative Hacken Phillips for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for taking my question,
Sure.
Mr. Bradley. I'm wondering if you could just kind of give us a quantitative picture. Could you let us know how large this undischarged population with no place to go that's safe, how large that is for the state?
Certainly. So the hospitals have done a they did a report in September. We did a report in September, and we have a recent update that's come out from the total comprehensive amount capacity that are waiting in a hospital bed that could be discharged for various reasons on any given day. It's over 100 patients. And for homelessness, housing, and security, I would say upwards of a dozen or more.
Further questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you for your
Thank you,
testimony.
Mr. Chairman.
Next, call upon Katja Fox from the Health and Human Services.
Good morning, Chairman Weiler and members of the committee. I am Katja Fox. I am the Director of the Division for Behavioral Health for the Department of Health and Human Services. With a statewide rental vacancy rate of less than 1% and a median rent of over $1,700, close to $1,800, more people are experiencing homelessness, and there's been an increased demand on the homeless shelter system in New Hampshire. It's a issue, the question comes up, how do we address it? Well, it's a multi-pronged approach that's going to be needed. And the shelters, two of which you heard from this morning, nonprofits, community action programs, and municipalities are all critical stakeholders in the work to address homelessness. So SB 406 has had a couple of iterations, and right now the bill as amended and as it appears before you would provide the funding to those homeless shelters and would increase their rate from $20 a day to $27 a day. And we, again, I think it's been mentioned, we really appreciate the legislature's support. In the last budget process, we're getting closer to the cost, which is about $47 a day, and that's from a couple of years ago. So we know that those costs have increased, and this bill will help close that gap. And so therefore I'm here to speak in support of this bill. One of the things that's really important to know is that these aren't the only funds that the homeless shelters have. They do a ton of grant writing and fundraising. So their budgets, we have the allocations to them, and I have that information if needed for this afternoon for the work session about how much each of the 13 agencies statewide receive in funding. So they're cobbling funds together on a regular basis. And let me see what else I may have missed. Again, we have 13 agencies that we fund through the department, and that is statewide coverage. There are a total of 950 shelter beds in the state that we fund. And I can pick up some of the other questions that were asked, probably best left for the work session this afternoon, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions from the director? Representative Telersky.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, how many, with 950 beds in the state, how many would we need to accommodate where we're at?
I don't have the answer to that question. I might be able to come back with it this afternoon, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from committee? Can you attribute anything to this increase?
I think that the representative from Legal Assistance had a good response. I think that we have seen the erosion of permanent housing. So a lot of the efforts, rightly so, have been for the absolute worst case scenario, which someone is homeless. And so we have homeless shelters. We have transitional housing of individuals who are stepping down from another level of care who are going into transitional housing. We don't have enough of the supportive permanent housing available to help individuals thrive in their communities and be able to maintain stature in the community. So I think it comes down to affordable housing, and that's all the way, up and down the spectrum of independent housing, single family homes, etc.
Thank you. Representative Grassi for a question.
To follow up on the chairman's question, would you believe that a constituent of mine called me last week with a 83-year-old woman who was in his church, who makes about $900 a month in Social Security, had rent at $850 a month. The landlord went up to $1,800 a month on her rent, and she was basically asked to leave her apartment, and she's now sleeping on the couch of this gentleman's house because they cannot find an apartment for her.
Further questions from committee? Seeing none. Thank you, Director. Next call on Mara Devlin, Families in Transition.
You need to hit the red button.
And thank you for
Thank you
having
very
written
much.
testimony.
My name is Maria Devlin. I am the president and CEO for Families in Transition, headquartered in Manchester, New Hampshire. I am here with Erica Diamond, who is our director of grant compliance for the organization. Many of you probably know about Families in Transition. We're a 501c3. We have an array of services that go from emergency homeless sheltering to actually permanent housing. The work that we do includes the largest adult shelter in the state of New Hampshire at 138 beds for men and women. We also serve 11 families every single night, 46 beds at our family shelter. Right now, we have 84 adults and 114 children, which makes up 62 families from across the state on our wait list for family sheltering. Almost every single night at our adult shelter, we turn away men and women in the city of Manchester. And mind you, the city of Manchester also has its own shelter that serves about 40 people every single night. So right there, we can add up very quickly for adult men and women. The need in Manchester is pretty great. But again, we serve people from across the state. Based on our budget, for us to run our emergency shelters every single night is $45 per bed per day. Every single shelter is a little bit different. If you have to rent a place, we own our building. It's an old and horrible building, but it does serve the people that we need to serve. But that $45 per bed per day does not include our indirect costs. So this past year, I had to put in a new HVAC system. I had to put in a new roof 2 years ago. So those costs are not in that $45 per bed per day. That is the basic cost to run the program, to provide the services, the 3 meals a day, et cetera, for our clients. Right now, we have about a $1.5 million gap between the services that we provide and the funding from the state. So that $1.5 million gap comes from our philanthropic efforts. So you've heard the shelters before me and a few others who have said that we're depending on the New Hampshire community members and businesses to help fund that gap. And what happens if we can't fund that gap this year? This is a decision that Families in Transition is taking very seriously right now. Through the years of COVID, we had quite a bit of money to help support our services. We even grew our services over the time that COVID had happened. When we took over the adult shelter in 2018, it served 70 people. We're now at 138. So we grew by almost twice the size, which of course increased the costs as well. But right now we're at a point where if we cannot get more funding, that $1.5 million deficit is unsustainable. So we are looking at decreasing our services, and that could take two different paths. One path could be that from spring till October, we actually close down during the day. This is not something we do right now. We're a 24-hour operating shelter. So during the day, our folks are not asked to leave. They can stay in the building. They have lunch. They go to programming. They meet with their case manager. And we also have resource fairs throughout the month where community partners, DMV, welfare, everyone comes into our building to serve the population. If we're unable to do that during the day, we would be then sending 138 men and women into basically downtown Manchester to find something to do for the entire day. The other thing we could do is actually reduce our numbers, our nightly number. That would then reduce our head count. It would reduce the food count. We would look at going from 138 men and women to 70, back down to its original size. This is an issue that has to do a little bit with the building that we have, and it's because it's on 3 different floors. If we've closed off some of the floors, we then can have staffing in a much smaller place. We run on a staffing model. For us, it's extremely important to have the right staffing on for 138 men and women. So we have 3 different floors. We have to staff each of those floors. The reason why it's important to have appropriate staffing is, number one, it is a safety issue. Number 2, we're actually looking after people who, because we are also a low barrier shelter, if they have used during the day, oftentimes we are providing Narcan and calling 911. So we're not having overdose deaths at our location. Last night, for example, this morning, we actually had an OD. We were able to provide Narcan, but that's only because our 3rd shift staff stay awake all night long and basically look at everyone and make sure that they're breathing every single night. So the funding is not a huge increase. There's still going to be a gap, but for us, it's a way for us to shrink our current deficit. And that's really the most important thing for us. We do very well by raising about $2.7 million philanthropically for our organization, which is actually quite a bit of money. But this would help shrink the deficit and really help us put us in a stable place for the time that it's here. We're going to be visiting again next year. I know it's going to be tough, another tough year. But as people said, until there's more housing, there's no place for people to go. We have people who are in our shelter, families and adults who have been issued a voucher, but there's no place for them to use that voucher. And after a year, that voucher becomes null and void. So it is an extremely difficult place that we're in here in the state of New Hampshire. We also provide housing. Unfortunately, we're not in a place to build more housing because it is too expensive. It would take a couple of years to build the appropriate housing, but we have 20 other buildings that we use for housing, which are also not running in a positive. And so taking on another permanent supportive housing project is something that's really tricky for us, but something that we're committed to. We just have to figure out how to do it. Happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Diamond, do you have anything to add?
No.
Thank you. Representative Edwards for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the work you do. I'm curious if you know whether or not asylum seekers that are recently arrived in country, if they're eligible for your shelter services, and if you're seeing any increase in that particular subset of the population seeking housing.
So we are seeing some folks who are illegal immigrants coming into our shelter. Finding housing is extremely difficult for somebody who is here and doesn't have the proper identification. In fact, it's impossible. It is a challenge for us to figure out. We need to work with the Department of Health and Human Services and other community services in order to help serve this group. We have had about 14 individuals at our adult shelter throughout the course of the year who do not have any identification. It's not something that we would say is anywhere close to what is happening down in Massachusetts. There's certainly a concern of that, but we're a low barrier shelter. And as far as I know, our contract is that we serve anyone who comes to us who is seeking shelter and support.
The bill says prioritize needs of veterans. Do you do that?
Yes, we do. In fact, there's two prioritized groups that we work with. Veterans is one, due to the fact that there's lots of other services out there that can serve veterans and actually get them housed very quickly. So as soon as we know that we have a veteran at our location, we hook them up with the services if they're agreeable to it so that they can be housed much more quickly than many others. The other group we prioritize in our adult shelter is young adults, so men and women between the ages of 18 and 24. The adult shelter is not the appropriate place for them, so we work really hard with Waypoint and other groups who service youth. It's better for youth to be housed in a different manner than at an adult shelter. So those two groups are prioritized for us.
Thank you. All right, further from Representative Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've mentioned this term of art, a low barrier service, something like that. Is that a low barrier standard requirement defined by the federal government or through grants that you've received? What are the circumstances under which the state may change your designation and create a little bit more of a barrier?
I believe that's probably a question for Katya, but it is in our state contract. We're a low barrier shelter. So, for example, we accept sex offenders. We accept people who with a criminal record. We accept folks who other shelters may or may not be able to accept. And that's what makes it low barrier. Many of our folks are using substances. They abuse alcohol and or drugs. And as long as they can be safe for themselves and for the other folks who are with us, that is okay. We work with them on if they want to go to treatment, but as long as they can kind of hold themselves together and it's a safe place for them to be, it's better for them to be in a safe place every single night, get a meal, and talk with people about their sobriety when they have a place to sleep.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Representative Stringham.
Just looking at the numbers, there's 46 beds in the family shelter and another 138, so it's a total of 184 capacity. So if your costs are 45 a day, you're looking at roughly $3 million a year in operating costs. That doesn't include any capital needs you have, like your boiler and roof or building repair and so on.
Correct.
So obviously the community really admires what you're doing. They've been very generous with you, and I thank you for coming in. I just wanted to confirm those numbers.
Thank you very much.
Anything further from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The last person I have a card for is Rebecca Beaton from 100 Nights. And we're coming up on the time that we allotted for this. There's a group meeting in the other room as soon as we finish here. I'll go open it up and assess it.
Thank you for hearing me, Mr. Chairman and members of the House Finance Committee. Just for the record, my name is Rebecca Beaton. I'm the Executive Director for 100 Nights in Keene, New Hampshire. We do currently provide overnight shelter services as well as providing day services in our resource center. We serve up to 48 individuals, including men, women, and families, which does include minors. Additionally, we provide the day services, 3 meals a day during the week. Weekends, we work with partners in the community to provide food. We have a case manager on staff for both our existing guests as well as potentially individuals who have the potential to become homeless to help them prevent that. We do have a case manager on staff that works with anybody who comes into the shelter and needs those services. We did just recently increase from 24 beds to 48 beds with the construction of our new facility. And the space potentially has capacity for more once we get approval from the city. So this definitely does assist that process. But again, we are trying to really fill our beds are at full capacity every night. If we have a vacancy, it's filled almost immediately. For numbers, in the last week, we do keep this track for the census for the state. We actually had to turn away 21 individuals, including a family of 3. And that is typical for any week that you would look at. And it does actually get worse over the colder months. We do continue to receive the funding from the state grant and aid program. The increase from $8 to $20 definitely helped, and this will be definitely beneficial to continue with more sustainable funding. It doesn't reflect the full cost of the shelter bed, as been said before, let alone the additional services we provide. The average cost for 100 nights based on our 2023 operating expenses was $42.80. That is just for shelter services. Once we include all of the day services that also provide services to people who are not staying, that increases to $64.08. We do rely upon mostly philanthropic, and so that is unguaranteed money, and so that does cause concern for the services that we can continue to provide. That gives us about $770,000 in philanthropic funding that we are trying to get, and that is a big deficit that could be really hard to close if those were to go away. So the more funding that can be guaranteed is better for the shelter to be able to stay sustainable. That obviously does impact whether or not we can provide the day services. As Maria had mentioned, that could potentially mean that we close the shelter during the day and stop providing those day services, adding those people back into the population walking around in our downtown area. And that, can cause its own problems. We're committed to our work. We have some great supporters, but again, it's not secure funding, and that can be a real big concern. We did start out as just 100 nights. We were open for the 100 coldest nights of the year. That is hence our name. In 2017, we did become year-round shelter because the need grew. And then with the pandemic, we have been at full capacity ever since the pandemic started. And federal funding helped, but it's gone. So now we are very much just relying on all of that. I do welcome any questions, and I do have written testimony here that I can provide as well.
Appreciate for the written testimony. Questions from the committee members? I have one more card. If there's no questions, thank you for your testimony. Now I have Michelle Merritt from New Futures. And she has written testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, honorable committee members. My name is Michelle Merritt. I'm the president at New Futures. I'm going to make this short and quick because you've heard from others who have really covered this topic, but I wanted to state for the record New Futures' support of Senate Bill 406, and particularly for the overlap between individuals with substance misuse disorders, mental illness, and who are experiencing homelessness. That this particular piece of legislation fills a critical gap and helps to stabilize those that are serving our most vulnerable Granite Staters. So with that, I just wanted to again state New Futures' support for this particular piece of legislation. I'm happy to answer questions, but again, I think many of them have already been answered, and I have written testimony that I will submit to the committee.
Thank you. Further questions from committee?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
We have one more person signed up that didn't speak, Pamela Kellig. New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic Domestic and Sexual Violence. We will now recess this to the afternoon at 2:30, when there'll be a joint hearing in here between Division, I guess it's Division 3 work session at 2:30 this afternoon on this bill and on 311.
So, Mr. Chair, is that technically a recess for this committee? This was meant to be the full Finance Committee today, and this afternoon is explicitly intended to be Division 2 and Division 3 in a joint work session. So are we adjourning this hearing?
We're adjourning the full committee and we're recessing to Division 3.
Thank you, sir.
For the bill, people that are interested in the bill. It's mainly people that are interested in the bill rather than.
And
who-
Division
who's here.
2 is currently in recess on 396, so if you can get over to our 209, we'll refire the
Okay.
bring your nameplates.